Welcome to our Beer U module on English Pale Ales. English Pale Ales are not only fantastic beers in their own right, but they're also the model for many of the great craft beers that we enjoy today. Their history dates to the early 19th century, and they've got 200 plus years of fascinating history behind them. We'd appreciate it if you could grab an English Pale Ale and join us in tasting one while we explore them. Here's a list of them that you can refer to when making your choice, but please feel free to bring along your favorite English Pale Ale on our journey, no matter which one it is. The color of English Pale Ales vary widely from a dark gold to a light brown color. As we'll see, pale didn't mean extremely light in color where these beers were concerned. Most English Pale Ales are relatively low in alcohol, and it is rare to find versions of them above 6.2% alcohol by volume. Stronger beers than this typically fall into the strong ale category. Bitterness is one of the most notable distinctions of the English Pale Ale, and on the IBU scale they usually range from 25 to 50. All English Pale Ales have a relatively bitter or hop-forward character. Compared to other traditionally English beers, an English Pale Ale is generally less hoppy and darker than an India Pale Ale, not as dark and more bitter than an English Brown Ale, not as dark or strong as a porter, not nearly as dark or strong and less roasty than a stout, and not nearly as strong as a strong ale. English Pale Ales aren't really pale, at least most of them aren't. Most English Pale Ales are dark gold to amber in color, with some ranging into the brown color range. So why are they called pale? In the early 19th century, when English Pale Ales first started to become popular, they were, in fact, lighter in color than the most popular beers of the time, porters. People were used to dark beers, and the term pale was coined to define them as being lighter in color than porters. In time, English Pale Ales actually replaced porters as the popular style of beer. Malt is what gives beer its color, and prior to the 19th century, most malt was dark in color. A product of the Industrial Revolution, the coke-fired oven, made pale-colored malt possible on a large scale. It dried the malt without any smoke or contaminants, leaving it pale in color. Malt gives beer its color, so you can't make a pale ale with dark malt. Creating pale malt was the key step towards creating pale ales. Traditional English Pale Ales feature English-grown hops, although some brewers will add American or other hops on occasion. More specifically, the hops used for these beers are usually the Fuggles or Goldings varieties that are known for their bitter flavor and piney, fruity aromas. English ale yeast are used and are known to contribute a lot to the character of the beer, but variations of yeast strains abound in England that create various flavors. The yeast character can differ dramatically from region to region or from brewery to brewery. English Pale Ales feature hop-forward bitterness that is a product of the Fuggles and Goldings hops that are commonly used. Yeast can also contribute significantly to the flavors found in English Pale Ales. They often contribute fruity flavors, albeit at normally low or subtle levels. Some versions contain low levels of diacetyl that produces a buttery or butterscotch flavor. While this is considered acceptable for English Pale Ales, some brewers and drinkers find the presence of diacetyl to be a flaw. English Pale Ales evolved from the India Pale Ales that became popular in the late 18th century. Originally brewed in London for shipment to overseas destinations, India Pale Ales gained much popularity with English drinkers, and in time, many brewers around England began to brew them for more local consumption. Over time, advances in brewing techniques and the changing taste of British drinkers made the lower alcohol Pale Ales more popular with consumers. In the beginning, brewers and consumers simply called many of the pale-colored beers Pale Ales. Today we use the term English Pale Ale to distinguish between the British Pale Ale and the more aggressively hopped American Pale Ales. But in the early part of the 19th century, there were two pale-colored beers available to British drinkers, the hop-forward Pale Ales and the Mild Ale, a beer that came in pale variations, but which is a malt-forward beer. Consequently, customers began to ask for a bitter when ordering a beer to make sure they got the hop-forward English Pale Ale instead of the malt-oriented mild. Eventually, the name stuck with brewers as well as drinkers. In some cases, the term English Pale Ale is used to describe the stronger or bottled versions, while the term bitter is reserved for the traditional cask versions only. Porters came onto the scene in the early part of the 18th century and gained immense popularity with British drinkers for many years. But over time, people began to tire of porters for a number of reasons. First, competition was tough amongst porter brewers, and some of them, and many pub owners, began to cheapen their versions to gain a price advantage. This helped lead to a decline in overall porter popularity. Second, economic conditions that previously favored the porter style started to turn in favor of lighter-colored beers. Specifically, pale-colored malt was more efficient in the brewing process, which made the darker malt-based porter more expensive for brewers to create. And once pale-colored malt was available in large quantities, it made more sense for brewers to brew pale-colored beers. While people were getting tired of porters, conditions were starting to favor the English Pale Ale. First, transportation from brewing centers like Burton became more economical as trains started to run between Burton and the large beer-drinking markets like London. And when glass became cheaper and more common, it did help popularize pale ales as it showed off the then new colors in the beer. People were also very excited at the prospect of a new kind of beer. They were intrigued by the lighter colors and hop-oriented flavors that they had not really experienced before on a large scale. Burton, also known as Burton-on-Trent, is the city that made English pale ales famous. Other cities produced pale ales, but it was the Burton version that drinkers got excited over. Burton had been a brewing center long before the introduction of English pale ales. Brewers there had been successful in shipping dark ales to the Baltic countries and gained much business when the British East India Company asked them to begin producing India pale ales for shipments overseas. But as the economics of transportation and materials changed, Burton gained an advantage as they could better compete selling beer in major domestic markets like London. As it turns out, Burton's biggest advantage was in the ground all around the city. The soil there contains a high amount of calcium sulfate in the gypsum deposits in the hills around Burton. The water supply is therefore heavy in calcium sulfate, which pleasantly accents the hop flavors of English pale ales. Burton brewers had a huge advantage with their superior water for many years, but eventually brewers in other cities realized that they could recreate the Burton water by simply adding gypsum to their own water. To this day, this process is known as Burtonizing water. In the early 19th century, railroads were just starting to come into existence, and the establishment of rail lines between the main English Pale Ale brewing center in Burton and the major markets like London opened up new markets for the Burton brewers. Glass also became more economical quite suddenly when in 1845 the glass tax was abolished. For the previous 100 years, glass had been severely taxed, and because of that, English brewing tradition emphasized kegged and draft beer, an emphasis which is still felt to this day. The repeal of the glass tax made it more economical for beer to be bottled and for drinkers to enjoy their beers in a clear glass that highlighted the lighter colors and translucence of the English Pale Ale, making them even more appealing. Bitters are traditionally a draft-only beer, though today many bottled versions do exist. The purist might say that the only true bitter is a non-pressurized, naturally fermented version served from a cask. They would discount the pressurized keg and bottled versions entirely. And it's true that modern kegs and bottles make the beer different, and many would argue that the bitter loses its subtle complexity anywhere outside of the cask environment. Today, many brewers use modern kegs and bottles for beers they term bitters and English pale ales, though the formulation of those versions is often somewhat different than those served from a cask. Export versions, sometimes bottled, are often brewed to higher alcohol strengths and pasteurized to keep the beer fresh and drinkable, though some of the beer's character is lost in that process. Several variations of the English Pale Ale have been classified, though they all share a great deal in common. All of them feature a strong balance between malt and hop flavors, though they are more hop-forward than the milds or the other sweeter traditional beers. Traditionally, all versions of the English Pale Ale are served from a cask, though plenty of kegged and bottled versions are available. Again, the purist might not consider the kegged or bottled versions to be a true English Pale Ale or bitter. All bitter variants are sometimes brewed light in color and called golden or summer ales, while kegged and bottled versions are typically brewed to higher alcohol levels, which makes them more durable on store shelves and for export. The standard or ordinary bitters are the lowest alcohol version of the English Pale Ale. Their low alcohol content and balance makes them extremely drinkable, and they are designed to be consumed in quantity by pub goers who may spend many hours with them. This beer is often referred to simply as a bitter. The special, best, or premium bitter is a higher alcohol version of the bitter, and they are a little more malty and hoppy. But in many ways, they are the same kind of beers, just brewed at differing strengths. Topping out at around 4.6% ABV for the style, they are still extremely drinkable. The term best bitter is usually reserved by a brewer to name the beer he feels is his best offering. The term extra special bitter has become something of a catch-all phrase in the U.S. to describe all English-style pale ales, but traditionally the phrase is used to describe the strongest versions of the English pale ale. The extra special and strong bitters are known for more malt and hop flavors than the other versions, which is partly a product of their higher strength. In England, it would be common to call the extra special or strong bitter simply an English pale ale, while the other varieties are known more simply as bitters. When serving an English pale ale, a Nonic style pint glass is the best option. It's a traditional English glass, and the bulb helps to retain the head of the beer. Food pairings abound with English pale ales because of their balanced nature and low to middle intensity. English foods are an obvious choice. The beers and the food grew up together and can be extremely complementary to each other. Fish and chips, sausages, shepherd's pie, and all sorts of cheeses are terrific with these beers. When creating a pairing of your own, look for foods that are mild to medium in intensity. Heavily flavored or spicy foods can overwhelm the more subtle character of the beer, although it can be terrific to drink English pale ale with Indian food. Many roasted meats and mild cheeses are great choices as well. Try treating yourself to the simple yet abundant pleasure of an English pale ale with an English cheddar or some Wensleydale. Congratulations, you've finished the module. Hopefully you'll have a few minutes to take the optional quiz that is coming up. Like I said, it's optional, but if you are taking a Beer U curriculum and need to get credit for this module, you'll have to take the quiz and get at least 70% of the answers correct in order to show this module is complete. Good luck!